Have you ever wondered how your grandmother created all the delicious pies you ate as a kid? It seemed like grandmothers knew the secret to our hearts through her pie recipes. So let's look at some cherished pies she used to make. So we will start this list off by paying respects to tradition, as our elders did much before us with their cooking. And what better dish for that than Southern Possum Pie? A graham cracker crust with sweetened cream cheese and pecans made for an incredibly earthy, crunchy pie that felt amazing to munch with every bite. The crust was to die for, and it made the pecans so much more appetizing than they had any right to be. Pair that up with some creamy pudding, 2 layers of chocolate and vanilla, and last but not least, topping it off with some whipped cream, and you have one incredible competitor for Sunday's lunch plans. Though we all know our grandmas would make too much for one sitting anyway. A lot of our grandparents had to go through one of the most haunting patches of history, the Great Depression, and they had to whip up entirely new cooking ideas to get by. One of these was the water pie, which created a buttery pie with the main ingredient being its namesake, literally just water. So actual ingredients for pies became so incredibly difficult to get, and people had to go weeks without what was once easily available comfort food. That was just the best case scenario, and the likely case was that people would not taste the pies of their childhood for a very long time. However, a lot of chefs came to the rescue of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties everywhere with the water pie. Just some water, sugar, and butter plus cinnamon and a store-bought crust was enough for this. Speaking of buttery pies, let's talk about the Grapefruit Meringue Pie, which was one of the propellers of meringue pies in America, and your grandparents played no small part in that. Citrusy, creamy, and sour but fruity, this pie had an incredibly diverse range of flavors, giving it an edge over other pies in the game. It stood out for all the right reasons, and the aroma called to you every time, especially if it was coming from your grandmother's house as you got out of the car. Golden brown tart lemon layers with the sweetest, thickest meringue you could imagine on top, and some fresh grapefruits right from the market was about as good as being a kid could get in the 20th century. A favorite of not just grannies across the nation, but also George Clooney. Transparent pie raises an eyebrow because you hear the name and get curious, and that is why you come to the dish, but people always stay for the killer flavor. Nobody knows where the first transparent pie really originated from, but it has been popular in the South and Midwest in places like Mason County in northern Kentucky. It used the same ingredients as a water pie, but without the water, resulting in a richer, denser texture. Before you start wondering, no, the pie is not actually transparent. It probably got its name due to the heavy usage of vanilla that gives the pie its iconic essence. Or maybe our grandparents just went too overboard trying to make sure our sweet teeth were catered to. Let's take it up a notch with some fancy pies instead of basic ones, and the Cranberry Chiffon Pie does not disappoint by any means. Like a dish torn right out of a baking simulation game, with cranberry juice, oranges, egg whites, and more, this pie looks just a little better than it tastes. If the taste is a 10 out of 10, then we are dealing with a 10.5 in terms of appearance. Some things just go past your expectations, do they not? This was a pie you could find both in bakeries and in the homes of your family as you would visit, but there was nothing like a fresh chiffon pie right out of Grandma's oven. One blessed thing about the hand of a passionate grandparent cooking for their favorite family members is that they always knew how to get the best out of the bland and boring. Things like apples were suddenly key players in cultural delicacies like apple cider vinegar pie, when before, parents would struggle to get their kids to even maintain eye contact with an apple for more than 10 seconds. Granted, these were sautéed apples with vinegar, vanilla, cinnamon, and a lot of time in the oven, but they were still irresistible. A good cinnamon or maple syrup was the perfect sauce to round this pie off and bring its full potential as an acidic but sweet slice of heaven out. Apple cider vinegar has been a popular hit in America for many decades now, and it does not look like the grandparents of today intend to change that. Speaking of the chefs of today, they have some pretty interesting differences when it comes to the modern take on a mincemeat pie. These days you see dried fruits and even rum and brandy being used in the dish along with various spices. No sign of meat anywhere, despite it literally being in the name. In the past, mutton or ground beef and raisins, nuts, pecans, seasonal dry fruits like these were all you needed to make an exceptionally lovely mincemeat pie. This pie has always been typically served at Christmas, but it took off so well in the South that many families would just have it as a weekly dinner too. Do you have any memories of a mincemeat pie from your childhood days? What kind of differences can you note between the pies of then and now? We sure see a lot of differences. Extremely popular in states like Oregon was the purple plum pie, which sounds as appetizing as it actually is. People would use branded canned purple plums or homegrown ones and layer black plum slices to give an incredibly deep purple color, along with a very vivid texture. Think of it like a tart cherry pie that you could really sink your teeth into, where the food just seems to melt perfectly in your mouth. In terms of syrup, most people thought to keep it plain and simple with just a good and proper lavender syrup because it really brought out the vanilla extract in the pie. Plum pies were always a big hit in America, but this dish took it a step further and solidified them as one of the many gems of the 1900s. The fact that it literally looks like a gem if you get a bit creative with the layering does not help at all. Vegetable pie recipes go all the way back to Europe, but this is about America, so let's stick to the Cliff Notes version of our history tour. Sweet potato pie actually got very popular in the southern parts of the USA during the colonial era, when America was still a colony under the British Empire. Sweet potatoes had always been used by Southern folk in their desserts. Initially, the vegetable was popularized by Black American households that spread their magic across the nation. It gets more interesting, though, as word is they got the idea from Native American cooking practices. Basically, the rabbit hole of who made it first can go deep, but none of that matters when you consider how cost-effective and delicious this pie is. Potatoes in general were becoming the top most consumed vegetable, and to find a way to incorporate it into a dessert for the masses is cooking talent at its finest. We all love a good chiffon pie cake, and grandmas are known to get pretty busy with them, especially if it is for a special occasion. We are not sure if Halloween comes into that for you, but for many kids in the late 1900s to 2000s, you could not celebrate October's finest activity without pumpkin chiffon pie. Made with a custard filling that used pumpkin and mixed with egg whites beaten to sheer, creamy perfection, gave the pie a fluffy meringue-like texture that really did justice to the chiffon genre of desserts. Plus, the granulated sugar brought out the best within the pumpkin. Grandmas all around had perfected the art of making sure the gelatin mixed as well as it could with the egg whites, and that is what made their pies so incredibly airy and weightless. Buttermilk coconut pies were usually 9-inch pie crusts filled with this rich, thick buttermilk custard that had these tropical notes of coconut accompanying it. Most people in the 1900s had this locked down and would regularly make it, passing the recipe on to their kids so that they could make it for their children one day. You cannot teach your grandmother to suck eggs, though, and neither can you teach her how to make a better coconut pie. Whether it was the amount of buttermilk, the flaky but crumbly crust, or the custard filling that lured you into an incredibly peaceful food coma, is beyond us. Buttermilk coconut pies had it all, though, and no one knew what the secret was. Was it how they beat the eggs to perfection, or the small window of a few seconds between perfectly golden brown and overdone? Either way, making one of these was like a Tuesday afternoon reflex to many grannies. Since we are on the topic of tropical pies, let's take a look at chocolate Haupia pies, which were a pretty regular staple of Hawaiian cuisine. These also had their fair share of coconut-based goodness, as they would be covered with a coconut Haupia layer that would be made using thickened coconut milk. Then you would just layer the chocolate into a pie crust and top it off with however much whipped cream you fancied. Next to hula pie, this is probably one of the most famous pies to ever come from the island of Hawaii, and even McDonald's had their own brief take on it, though it came nowhere close to the bangers you would experience from the locals. If you are one of the people who enjoys a good coconut-based dessert, then maybe try this one out someday. There is probably a good reason why it got so popular across America. The goodness of a peanut butter cream pie does not have to end at just the ones you get from Little Debbie's, at least not for a lot of families that grew up with the confection. It was a very balanced harmony of flavors that were a bit unfamiliar when you thought about the fact that they are in a pie, but it made them work just as well as any other classic. Peanut butter and cream cheese will surprisingly go very well together. There are even no bake versions, which make it a lot easier to whip this up or even get a batch going. Actually, most pies in this list have no bake versions, and one thing you will notice even with this one is that a lot of them are incredibly easy to make. Not at all as complicated as the show-stopping desserts of today, perhaps keeping it simple is where the real magic lies. After all, nothing ever went wrong with an extra helping of peanut butter. Are grapes not really up your alley? Have you ever tried a grape pie? This specific one actually goes back to the 1950s in Naples, New York, and the Finger Lakes regions, and it first went mainstream thanks to the efforts of Irene Bouchard. She would churn out unbelievable amounts of these from the 50s to the 80s, and we dare say grapes as a whole got some newfound respect because of her. Regularly, thousands of grape pies would be sold at the Naples Grape Festival, and their annual haul is around 20,000 grape pies. As you can tell, these people do not play about their grapes. Concord ones were the kind that worked best for this pie, and with some Welch's grape juice would go excellently with it, and the pie would be layered with pastry dough. It got popular enough with bakers at home, and that is the story of how Concord grape pies are a long-held New York tradition. Now here's a proper vintage one off of the history shelf. Gooseberry pies actually go back all the way to the kitchens of the 1700s, where they were still the delight of bakers and grandmas across the country. Local town bakers would make smaller and more plain versions of these, while they were a very trendy choice for local fairs and baking contests. While you might think that a lot of Americans do not favor the gooseberry too much, that definitely took a turn in the 20th century when it started being a snack for people in rural southern areas and urban Midwest ones. This also meant that it would eventually pave the way for it to be centered in the world of baking, and gooseberries were all you needed besides some water and stevia. Also, instead of all-purpose flour, eventually around the 1980s it became more common to use tapioca flour. If you have had this, do you remember how your family used to make it? Sugar cream pie, Hoosier pie, a desperation pie. It has many names, but they all share the same glorious flavor. In case you have never heard of what a desperation pie is, it is just a baked dessert with simple ingredients plus whatever cooks had on hand that could complement stuff like butter, sugar, and eggs. However, this pie's custard filling was made without the use of any eggs, and it just took some flour and cream. It had one other name, which was the finger pie, and that nickname stuck around because of how cooks would stir the filling with their finger to avoid breaking the crust. If you have not had it, think of it like a chess pie, but it looks significantly more appetizing than that. Also, this was the unofficial pie of the state of Indiana. Lots of grandmothers and home bakers would regularly be whipping up a hearty sugar cream pie, and the large interest in it probably started from there too. Lemon chiffon pie is an incredibly popular pie all the way from the 1920s, and it rightfully deserves its place in America's Culinary Hall of Fame. The chiffon pie concept, which was first made by Monroe Boston Strauss in 1926, was mentioned in magazines like The Ladies' Home Journal because of how popular it became with housewives at the time. Monroe Boston Strauss was an acclaimed pie celebrity with the title of Pie King. He must have had a pretty good reason for going around and owning that, since the chiffon pie speaks for itself. And the addition of lemon followed suit pretty quick. The very first Strauss recipe took cornstarch thickened liquid and a dome-shaped filling, but many now grandmas turned it into their own brainchild as they tirelessly remade the pie, shaking up the baking scene in America until it became muscle memory. Custard pies refer to uncooked custard mixtures that are put in a cooked crust and then baked together, and they were a pretty big hit in North America. Of course, you have the usual criminals when it comes to ingredients, such as vanilla extract and granulated sugar, but interestingly enough, many housewives opted for a dash of nutmeg too. Do not mix this up with cream pies as that uses cooked custard, and many pro-home bakers would make the perfect custard pie by making the most out of how eggs work as great bindings. Also, if you remember buttermilk pies from just a while ago, then it is also another kind of custard pie. Popular spins on the dish would see almonds being used or turning it into a bean or potato pie, but those are all from many years ago now. Dry fruit pies are making a comeback from their original glory days in the 40s and 50s, and back then home chefs would use cornstarch, distilled white vinegar, and double-crust pie pastries in theirs. The generally accepted status quo was always a single crust pastry, very light and delicate, but these ones were thick and required you to really bite into them. That made the eventual crunch all the more satisfying though, and hot raisins were the perfect crunch to discover as your teeth went deeper into the crust. It made for an incredible experience both sensation-wise and with the flavor, and we hope that grandmas today bring it back fully. Rhubarb Custard Pie is the final one on our list, but this was one of the most perfect summer treats you could indulge in. And if you were one for rich egg custards or tart rhubarbs, then that applied to you even more so than the average Joe. Lots of housewives perfected their pie crust recipes as well as their custard-making skills to bring both together so that the end product was the most heavenly rhubarb custard pie you would ever lay your eyes on. Luckily, the recipe was always passed down too. Let's talk a little about that concept. Why do people pass down their recipes so rigorously? A lot of these recipes on the list are not just fun, tasty treats to make up, but a way of expression that is packed with fond memories for the people who were making them. And there is a lot of effort put into each one. There would be years of sweat and effort put into making it the incredible dinner it was. Rhubarb custard pies were no different, and even today, many families use their grandma's recipes. That's it for all the pies we might have forgotten but live on in the memories of our grandmother. Like, subscribe, and let's keep these memories alive.